a key feature of the kind of very libertarian small government model of conservatism is essentially just a disavowal of any responsibility to make moral or value judgments, to assert anything about the good life, to acknowledge the existence of failures in markets. Their argument is that the free market and liberty is the end unto itself. And if you have that freedom, and they will extend it all the way to, my right to purchase something made with slave labor in China, right? How dare the government intervene in that free market transaction? You end up with libertarians doing things like defending free trade with a communist authoritarian regime.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. Today, we're diving into the future of political economy. The old consensus is breaking down. In Canada, the US, and across the Western world, we face profound changes in trade, industry, national identity, and social well-being. Now, political players and thought leaders are challenging free trade orthodoxy, shareholder primacy, consumer-first economics. But it's not only the left that's pushing back against these long-standing norms. Increasingly, the questions are coming from members of the political right. Industrial policy is back, borders are a live issue, and questions many once thought settled, like what we owe to our workers, our communities, and our nation, are being asked again, and with new answers being proposed. And to help us unpack this, I'm joined by no one better, Oren Cass, founder and executive director of American Compass. Oren served as a senior advisor to Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, has written for Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, countless other publications, and is the author of a very influential book that lays out some of these ideas, The Once and Future Worker. And he's got a new book that we're going to talk about today, The New Right. He's one of the leading voices behind this new right economic and political agenda. The worldview is communitarian, worker-focused, and sharply critical of economic libertarianism and what I think he might call market fundamentalism. And for me, I'll just say that these questions are definitely more than theoretical. Here at MLI, we've been probing the boundaries of free markets, the proper emphases on values like autonomy and freedom, the need for national cohesion, and the ways that economic and social structures shape culture and community. And I know many Canadians are increasingly sensing that something isn't working. And it's not just in their pocketbooks, but their neighborhoods, their families, and their sense of optimism about the future. And before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these important conversations. So without further ado, Oren Cass, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you.
All right, so let's dive right in, Oren. Let's talk about the new right and this realignment in conservatism. So what gave rise to it in the U.S. and across the Western world? Because it's not just confined to the U.S. Maybe U.S. is ground zero. I'd be curious for your thoughts. Is it the failure of fusionism, the excesses of globalism, cultural drift, all these things, something deeper? Tell us.
Well, in a sense, I think it's all of these things. I think it's also helpful to see it to some extent not as sort of something new and different as much as a reversion to what conservatism traditionally had been. I think I'm glad to hear you raise the term fusionism. People aren't always familiar with it. It's sort of the political science term for the Reagan coalition that we think of, certainly in the United States, as very much synonymous with conservatism, with the right of center. But really, it isn't necessarily. It certainly has been in recent decades. But what Reagan did to assemble that coalition was take the sort of traditional conservatives and bring along with them the free market libertarians on the economic side and the foreign policy hawks who favored quite aggressive intervention globally. And what these groups had in common, of course, was a deep hatred of communism and a determination to win the Cold War in a way that I think the United States hadn't necessarily had in the prior decades. And so for that purpose, at that time, it was an extraordinarily powerful coalition. It was extraordinarily successful. I think it's very important to give it credit for, in fact, winning the Cold War.
Yeah.
But it's important to say that it wasn't certainly in all respects conservative, that free market libertarianism is not conservative. Friedrich Hayek has a very famous essay about this, literally titled "Why I Am Not a Conservative." And likewise, the sort of foreign policy interventionism that in the context of the Cold War might have been very consistent with conservative priorities. Once the Cold War was over, and it sort of just kind of became military adventurism and trying to remake other parts of the world, call it whatever you want, but it obviously was not conservative at all. And so I think what has happened, and again, the U.S. obviously was ground zero for a lot of this, but you had Thatcherism in the UK, certainly key strains of this in Europe. That sort of left versus right definition of the right in the context of the Cold War, in a sense, expired with the end of the Cold War, but it persisted as a political coalition for a couple of decades thereafter until it became so unsuccessful and unresponsive to what was actually happening in the world at that point that it did sort of fall apart. And you had the disruptions of Brexit, of Donald Trump. And now I think what you're seeing is conservatives reassert their leading role in right of center politics and trying to actually recover a sense of what it would mean to apply conservative principles to the problems of the 2020s, which is very different from sort of picking up a 1980 playbook and asking what tax cut a libertarian would have proposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And what's interesting is that you certainly see this more so in Canada, but the convergence between, what you just described and, our Liberal Party and the Democratic Party, they're in fact quite similar. And in Canada, even the center left now, it's kind of the procedurally conservative position to defend the liberal status quo, which they represent. But in fact, if you look at the Conservative Party, you look at versions of the Republican Party, they emphasize freedom more to a certain extent and market freedom, but they're remarkably similar in many respects, and oftentimes just kind of liberalism with a lag. Do you think this vision has produced kind of managed decline, social and moral decay? And I mean, I certainly think to a certain extent it's not conserving that much. It's conserving kind of this procedural commitment to rapid change. How would you respond to that?
I guess I would say not so much that it has produced it as that it has allowed it, because I think what's a key feature of the kind of very libertarian small government model of conservatism is essentially just a disavowal of any responsibility to make moral or value judgments, to assert anything about the good life, to acknowledge the existence of failures in markets. And, part of that is sort of quite principled. I mean, I will always give the libertarians credit for being principled. And, their argument is that the free market and liberty is the end unto itself. And if you have that freedom, and they will extend it all the way to, my right to purchase something made with slave labor in China, right? How dare the government intervene in that free market transaction? And when you've seen that attitude taken to its sort of logical conclusion, where and it almost becomes sort of a reductio ad absurdum, you end up with libertarians doing things like defending free trade with a communist authoritarian regime and saying that that's somehow what the free market looks like. You end up with a total inability to actually engage in any of the cultural debates that are going on, and an unwillingness to assert that forming a family and raising kids has any value beyond using those same resources to take vacations in Europe. And I think as a result, what you had was just an absence of conservatism. You had two political parties, neither of which was bringing real conservative values and focus to a lot of these issues. And everything was conducted in this very narrow space between the kind of classically liberal center left and classically liberal center right, with the fight just being about, which particular set of policies was going to generate the most growth and how much redistribution to do. And unsurprisingly, that didn't work. And, unsurprisingly, we're now facing exactly the set of problems I think you would anticipate in a society that had lost its conservative instincts and checks on some of the excesses you otherwise see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, fair. So I'm going to give you my sense of a diagnosis, the problem, and I'd like to hear what you think is the type of approach needed. So yeah, I would describe hyper-liberal, atomized, boundaryless, unmoored from institutions or identity, a lack of moral authority or authority figures and even institutions within society, inability to make value choices. Is that the diagnosis of the problem? And then what do you prescribe as a remedy? Because obviously there's certainly a lot of difference between the American Compass view and what the Trump administration is doing, for example. Do you think it's cultural resistance, it's political strategy, it's kind of very like strong and direct interventions? What do you think the right approach is?
Well, I think that diagnosis was incomplete. I think the diagnosis is accurate in the sense that we definitely do have a lot of those problems in our culture, but I think it reflects, to some extent, the very narrow aperture that conservatives have been looking at problems through, in an effort to ignore some of the more economic problems we have, some of the ways that freedom and liberty and markets and so forth are not the answer to every question. And so I think it's very important to recognize that we haven't just failed in the cultural sphere, we've failed in the economic sphere as well. And we've seen, certainly in the United States, a quite serious stagnation, whether you're talking about declines in investment and innovation, slowing growth, slowing productivity growth, very low wage growth for the typical worker. Even on its own terms, with the measures that we thought we were supposed to use to see how well the economy was doing, the economy has not performed the way that we expected it to, the way that we were promised it would if we pursued this economic model, and that then pays out in this space kind of that's in the overlap of the economic and cultural space. The
Mhm.
decline in family formation, decline in certainly fertility rates, the increasing levels of social decay. Those things certainly have cultural elements as well as economic elements, but I think it's very hard to make the case that they are entirely or even primarily cultural. And the best way to see this is to notice who they do and don't afflict, right? Those who this economic model has worked well for don't seem to have these cultural problems, right? What a strange coincidence that it is those who the economy has left behind, that is those who our economic model does not serve well, that are therefore facing the majority of the cultural deterioration as well. And so I think a major difference, what you're seeing from the new right, is just a willingness to reject the old orthodoxy. Because once you don't feel like you have to recite these dogmas about markets always being the right answer and being self-regulating and the free market always delivering the best outcome and government always making things worse, if you're not obligated by some religious compulsion to say those things, and you actually open your eyes and look at what's happening, you realize quite quickly, I think, that there's a lot there that has to be grappled with.
Mhm. So let's talk about this reassessment of the economic consensus then. Um, you say we don't have a free market and we don't have free trade, first of all. So how much of that statement are we to understand that we're not living up to ideals that you think we should more or less try to espouse, and how much of it is more a critique of the extent to which we rely upon them for answers to every question, for example?
Well, it's definitely both, but to some extent, I think the question underlying both sides of that is what is the ideal? I
Yeah.
think, so much goes back to even the basic error in thinking of what the invisible hand is. In some senses, it's a very unfortunate metaphor. The invisible hand sort of sounds magical, right? Like there's this incredible force out there that we can't even see that's going to do things for us. And that's not what Adam Smith was talking about at all. If you go back and look, he only uses the term once in his 2 volumes of The Wealth of Nations, and it's in a paragraph where he's not describing a magical force at all. What he says actually is that, insofar as you have a situation where people prefer domestic investment to foreign investment, that's literally how the paragraph starts. And insofar as the type of investment people want to do is the type that's going to maximize output and employment, then almost as if by an invisible hand, the private interest and the pursuit of that private profit will also serve the public interest. So that's obviously true, but it's almost a truism. It's not a magical force. It's a statement of the conditions in which markets will work well. And so
Mhm.
I think that's exactly how we need to think about it, that the ideal is not this sort of abstract platonic ideal of a market that, I've been fighting with some folks at the Wall Street Journal who were saying, the market just is. That, ever since hunter gatherers wandering through the woods, traded berries for sticks or whatever, like, there you go. That's a market. That's all you need to know. And that's not right at all. And again, from a genuinely conservative perspective, of course, we like markets. Of course, we prefer markets to any other way of organizing economic activity. But a productive market, a well functioning market, is one that relies on a wide range of institutions to support it, that requires various constraints on it, so that you actually do have that alignment. And the question that we stopped asking was, well, wait a minute, are the things that earn a lot of money also things that are good for workers, for the nation, for communities? Instead, we inferred this as some principle that whatever makes the most money must be good. And that's how you get this idea that, like, well, free trade with China is great because if corporations can make more money offshoring stuff to China, then we should want them to do that. And, private equity leveraged buyouts must be great because if people can make a lot of money levering up companies with debt and buying and selling them for pieces, then that must be something that's really good for the economy. And on the other hand, if, intensive capital investment in physical assets and building the next generation of leading edge semiconductor plants, well, if that's not where the highest profits are, then I guess that's not something we should be doing. And that was literally the mindset. I mean, there's a very famous quote from a conservative economist: computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? As if it just, you just, you didn't have to think about these things. And so I think, from that perspective, then you get into these questions of like, well, wait a minute, maybe we're just not being free enough, or maybe we're misunderstanding freedom. But that's not the problem at all. What we're misunderstanding is markets and the conditions under which markets actually generate the kinds of outcomes we want.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think it's so interesting that so much of this debate is actually lost in the nuance, and it's not this, kind of wholesale rejection of trade and markets, but exactly as you say, not absolutizing them. And just one comment to make about Adam Smith. I mean, I think it's important to remember he was first and foremost a moral philosopher who, first described this, the fostering of mutual sympathies as one of the main benefits of kind of direct exchange where people are providing things from one another. So there's dependence, there's these kind of shared emotional connectivity, all these sorts of goods. So we have to assess it in its broad scope to understand its value. Let's talk a bit about trade now. So you've compared persistent trade deficits to racking up credit card debt. But some economists say that there's no real loss in the equation. So, could you walk us through the actual mechanics here, the net inflows, outflows, assets versus consumption, and why you think it matters?
Sure. I think the important thing to understand when we're talking about trade, and then this is where trade deficits come in, is that all of the classical models of trade, the things you learn in Econ 101, the premise of comparative advantage, the arguments that Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill were making, it all assumes that there's an actual trade here, that the other side is making something that you want and you are making something that they want, and both sides benefit from that exchange. And I think by and large that's absolutely true. You can find some sort of interesting ways in which it might not be, but for the most part that's absolutely right. And by the way, that's the basis on which it still gets sold. If you go back and look at everybody promoting the idea of embracing China and welcoming into the WTO, what you'll see the economists saying is, oh, this is, all the advantages here is on the side of Americans and American workers, and we're going to get these incredible opportunities making things to sell to the Chinese, right? Nobody got up and said, you know why this is going to be great? It's going to be great because all the stuff we used to do here, they're going to go do in China now. We're going to lose all of the jobs, but we're going to get cheap stuff. Because that's obviously not a very good sales pitch to any rational citizen. And yet, when that's what happened, the economists now have the chutzpah to turn around and say, what are you talking about? This is great. There's no problem here. And the problem is that there's still, well, the problem is twofold. The first problem is that you, in fact, have hollowed out your industry, right? The things that you used to do. Not only have you lost all of those jobs, but you lose the supply chains, you lose the expertise. One of the things we see now as we start talking about reshoring is that even as economists were saying, oh, this doesn't matter as it was all going away, now you ask, well, why can't we do it anymore? And the answer is, oh, well, because all of that stuff was extremely important and we don't have it. And you just want to slam your head on the table. But the second piece of the problem is this longer term question of what the trade deficit means in financial terms. Because even though the trade isn't happening in the actual trade of stuff for stuff, the rest of the world isn't giving us the stuff for free. They do want something back. And what's happening is that instead of trading stuff they make for stuff that we make, they are trading stuff that they make for our assets. So what we literally send back in return, and the $1.2 trillion, well, that's goods, overall about $1 trillion trade deficit that the US has, what that represents is $1 trillion net more stuff coming from the rest of the world into the US, and the US sending back net $1 trillion of assets. Now, what do I mean by assets? In some cases, that could be real estate. In some cases, that could be corporate equities. In a lot of cases, it's debt. In a lot of cases, it's corporate debt or literally treasury debt. And so if you sort of try to trace the money around in a circle, you can either think about just the direct exchange of things going one way or the other, or you can think of it as, Americans buy all of this stuff from other countries. So the dollars go to those other countries. Those other countries don't turn around and use those dollars to buy stuff from us. Instead, those other countries lend the stuff back to the federal government, to corporations. And so at the end of the day, what has happened is the stuff has come to us and we've sent back pieces of paper saying, we owe you. we will pay you later. Now, in the case of something like real estate or equities, it's a little more nuanced because, of course, it's not literally a debt instrument. There's not an annual interest payment, but ownership of those assets, the reason that foreigners want to hold those things is because those likewise represent claims on our future profitability and prosperity. And so, Warren Buffett actually wrote about this all the way back in 2003 when things were kind of really starting to go off the rails. He likened it to mortgaging the family farm. And he was very opposed to it and recognizing the problem of deficits like this. And what you end up with at the end of the day does look a lot like deciding that rather than going out and getting a job and doing something productive, you're just going to take out a lot of credit cards. You're going to consume the stuff. You're going to end up with a big list of stuff you owe. And generally, we don't think that's a very, even though it might be fun to consume the stuff, I think most people have the good sense to say that's really not a very responsible way to either live one's life or conduct one's economic policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I'm hearing two principal issues. One is that work matters, both from a human well-being perspective, and this is something we're going to talk about later, because I know you're somewhat interested in Catholic social teaching, and that set of teaching certainly emphasizes the connection to both human dignity and psychological well-being. And then also from the perspective of the type of jobs we have in a country make a difference economically, in that they contribute differently to productivity, innovation, and they also have different sort of anchoring social effects like community. So that's one area, the importance of work and economic makeup, so to speak. And the other side, the trade deficit or surplus situation. To what extent, in that regard, is the issue bound up in the amount of debt that comprises it? Like how much of the issue is in fact that, versus this question of deficit or surplus?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, that's a distinction between a stock and a flow. The deficit or the surplus is the annual flow, and the debt, or you could have obviously a net accumulation of assets is the stock. That is the accumulation of those flows over time. So I guess I don't see them as necessarily different. I think one distinction that's really important to notice is that a temporary deficit, right? The fact that sometimes you might have a trade deficit, other times you might have a trade surplus, that obviously wouldn't be a problem at all. That would be quite natural. What's a problem is the persistent and ever widening trade deficit. And what's interesting to also notice is if you go back and look at what the economists thought, they didn't think it was possible to have persistent trade deficits like this. Go all the way back to Hayek and why he's not a conservative. He actually uses as one of his examples of his faith in the self-regulating market, the way exports and imports will come into balance over time, even though nobody knows how or why. Paul Krugman, in a famous essay that he wrote in the 90s on what we need to teach undergrads about economics, one of the key points he emphasized was that trade deficits are self-correcting. And it was funny, actually, I was doing a podcast with him a few months ago, and I said, this is a perfect example of where we got things wrong. And he kind of didn't remember even having said it. I said, no, here it is. Let me read you the line. Trade deficits are self-correcting. And he said, well, yeah, that was naive. And so again, if you're in that Adam Smith, David Ricardo model where trade at the end of the day is going to be balanced and you're trading stuff for stuff, then sure, you'll have deficits sometimes, surplus other times. It is the failure of the system to balance in the long run and the persistence in expanding deficits that both sort of are a flashing red light that says something's wrong here, and that produce that long run accumulation of debt that is a lot more costly.
Okay, very good. So let's come back to this question of how do we measure well-being and what we're really aiming for. GDP per capita, various aggregate economic measures are treated as kind of this gold standard of prosperity, but you've often pointed out that it's a pretty thin measure, your view, along with other commonly cited figures, that they're kind of effectively instances of correlation masquerading as causation, and they don't measure what's really important. So what, in your view, is missing from our understanding of economic success? Or even, I think it's fair to say that maybe part of the issue is that these things are taken to be correlated perfectly or as best you can with the kind of greater well-being that we all want.
Yeah, I think GDP is obviously a very important measure, right? We do want to know what the total output of the economy is. I think the mistake that we've made in over relying on it at the end of the day is to treat it as fungible. That this goes back to that kind of potato chips, computer chips. What's the difference? That's one very narrow example of the broader attitude that GDP is dollars, and you can use dollars for anything. And so I think we essentially chose not to consider at all the composition of that GDP. We chose not to consider the contributions to that GDP. And we chose not to consider the allocation of that GDP. So we said we don't care what we make. We don't care who's making it. We don't care who is actually the direct beneficiary of it. Because at the end of the day, if we don't make it and someone else does and we trade, that's just as good. At the end of the day, people don't, in fact, in formal economics, work is a bad thing. The less work you can do for the more stuff, the better. And of course, we have redistribution, right? The winners will compensate the losers. We can always collect more taxes from the people who are earning more and send that GDP to the people who are earning less. And there you go, you've solved the problem. And it's important to say that in a sense we did that. I think, one thing I find very puzzling is when people say like, well, the theory of free trade was that the winners could compensate the losers, but of course the problem is the United States doesn't. That's completely wrong. If you look at the expansion of our welfare state, if you look at the progressivity of our income tax, if you look at what has actually happened to people's consumption and material living standards, we absolutely succeeded in raising that across the board. I don't think there's any question that people at every socioeconomic level in the United States
Yeah.
have more stuff, up to consume more healthcare, you name it, relative to any other time in the past. And so again, if that's all you care about, and that's what economics says you're supposed to care about, then congratulations. But what we've seen happen, and to your point about sort of correlation versus causation, there is a way in which, yes, if GDP is rising and that is broadly shared and spread prosperity, that's phenomenal. And there was an assumption that that sort of happens automatically, right? The rising tide lifts all boats and so on and so forth. And what we've seen instead is that no, you can also have patterns of GDP growth that generate relatively good top line numbers, but that concentrate the benefits in ways that are very unhealthy for the society as a whole, that really harm and leave behind a lot of people. And that ultimately, in the dynamic sense, isn't even good for the growth of the economy. That is, at the point in time, you say, wow, look at that, look at all the stuff we got. But if you're sort of narrowing and concentrating and specializing in ways that reduce your lower your trajectory going forward, then you're not accomplishing what you need to. And that's what we've seen. On top of everything else, one thing I find very funny is people put up the GDP chart and they say, well, look at that, GDP is going up, so why is anybody complaining? It's like, well, at least have the common dignity, courtesy to take the first derivative of that and look at GDP growth. Because what we're seeing is GDP growth keeps getting slower, productivity growth keeps getting slower, investment is declining. And that's not what we want, and that's not what we thought was going to happen when we went down this path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting because I think, as you say, even if we take GDP per capita, net of the redistributions, and you hold up purchasing power as the example of people being able to access all of these other sorts of things that can be measured by the metrics. What if they don't have a job or meaningful work, or they're extremely lonely or isolated, or don't live in a community, or don't have family? So I think it really speaks just to the extent to which, the measures maybe are in need of supplementation, certainly not rejection, as I think is clear you're saying. These are absolutely crucial things that we need to look at, but look a little deeper as well. So I want to ask you about that now. What sort of metrics could better reflect the kind of well-being you're going for in, say, the American Compass model? And maybe if you thought about this, what are the kind of measures and benchmarks that you're looking to judge, the policy interventions here that are supposed to be leading to what you're aiming for?
Well, I think one very important shift, and we've actually seen this happen to some extent in recent years, is to focus more on wages, right? Because you say, like, okay, well, don't look at GDP, look at GDP per capita, because that at least divides by the population, but that tends to just sort of divide evenly. It doesn't take high earners versus concentrate high earners versus the typical earner into account. So, okay, let's at least look at sort of median income. But even then, one thing you find, and certainly is the case in the United States, is that to kind of make up for a gap and earn more income, households have all sorts of things they can do. They can work more hours. They can send a second person into the workforce. If you actually have the economy working the way capitalism is supposed to work, if you're generating the sort of prosperity you want to generate, the typical wage that the typical worker can earn should be rising, and it should be rising at least as fast as these other measures of growth and profits and so forth. So I think just typical wages is an incredibly important measure. I think it's also then really important to compare that to the cost of living and the cost of attaining middle class security. Because one thing economists do very well is they measure inflation. What is the change in the cost of the exact same set of stuff? And that's an important thing to know for all sorts of reasons. But anybody who understands the human condition also recognizes that the set of stuff you need for middle class security is also going to change over time. And that part of the deal in the sense of the social contract is that in an economy that is sharing prosperity widely, everybody gets to share in those gains. And so if you have a situation where, the things, yes, you can afford in 2020 the same thing you could afford in 1970, well, therefore you're just as well off. That's obviously not true. And so you also need some measure that looks at, okay, well, health insurance is more expensive because there are all sorts of fantastic new treatments. That's great. But it doesn't change the fact that healthcare is more expensive, right? Like the typical house in a good neighborhood may be bigger and have more appliances, and that's great. It doesn't change the fact that you now need to pay more to live in a good neighborhood. And so, something we do at American Compass is we've created what we call the cost of thriving index, which it drives economists nuts because it's not focused on these, very abstract, arbitrary measures of kind of pure fungible GDP. Instead, we said, well, let's take the typical wage of particularly a male worker, and let's compare that to actually buying the cost of things you'd associate with middle class security. Rent on a middle of the road house, being able to operate a car, being able to send your kids to public university, health insurance premium, basic basket of food. And if you look at it that way, what you find is that it has gotten much, much harder to make ends meet. You need many more weeks of work to afford that set of things. So much so that, back in the 1980s, a single typical male earner could afford all of that on about 40 weeks a year of work. Whereas now in the 2020s, you need more than 60 weeks. And obviously, there are not 60 weeks in a year. And so, that kind of measure, I think, again, it doesn't replace GDP and inflation. You need to know those things too. But it adds a really important perspective to understand what is happening, why it isn't good, and why people are frustrated. And then just add one more piece. I think, one very hard economic measure in there that's really important to look at is productivity. That at the end of the day, if capitalism is working well, if it's serving workers well, the productivity of the typical worker needs to be rising. And that's also something we just have not seen happening recently in the way it did historically.
Okay, fascinating. Let's talk about the trade-offs to achieving such a set of outcomes. What do you think they are? Do we need to accept slower growth, higher costs in exchange for some of these things?
Well, I think there has to be a distinction there between the short run and the long run, because I think in the short run, there are absolutely costs, and we'll come back and talk about those in a sec. But I do want to emphasize that in the long run, I think what we're talking about here is a essentially better and more productive system. That the set of choices we've made have not correlated to rising economic growth, higher investment, faster productivity growth, innovation, and that if we actually did focus more on the underlying elements of a healthy economy and not just trying to goose a couple of these top line measures, I think we'd actually have a much healthier economy on a much stronger trajectory. In the short run, I think there are absolutely costs to getting there. And one way to think about it is just to recognize that whether you're talking about the trade deficit, whether you're looking at our federal budget deficit, these numbers in the trillions of dollars in the United States, what they represent is just that we are consuming more than we're producing. And if you're saying that's not good, we want to change it, that's going to require consuming less and or producing more. Now, I think one thing that people make a mistake on a little bit is they just look at the situation and say like, well, I guess you're saying people are going to have to consume less. And that's not necessarily the case. You can also solve the problem by producing more. But I also think there's definitely an element that certainly in the short run, if we need more investment, that is going to come with some cost to consumers. And so I think it's sort of a very important question politically for the nation. Ultimately, is that a cost we're willing to bear? When you accept such costs up front for what you think is going to be a much better outcome in the long run, typically the term for that is an investment. We're talking about investments that we should be making and what the return on that investment will be. And I think there's actually a huge amount of enthusiasm and appetite for making that kind of trade-off, mostly because people have now seen the other side of it, right? I mean, going back to around the year 2000, we chose to make the other side of the trade-off. We said, well, what if we don't worry about investment? What if we don't worry about production? What if we just focus on the cheap stuff? Won't that be great? And that's what happened. We didn't worry about the investment. We didn't worry about the production. We got the cheap stuff. And people are looking at that trade-off and saying, wow, that was really not the right trade-off. And so I think there's a lot of appetite for taking the other side of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, short-term pain for long-term gain. And I guess only time will tell. I'll have to wait and see whether the American Compass playbook yields the results. Let's shift gears now, Oren, to the cultural side of the equation, values. You've written that shared values are essential to a healthy society. And in a great First Things article that I would encourage everyone to check out, you took on the question of the relationship between religious reasoning and foundation to this question of shared values. So do you think that even without belief in God, secular reasoning can recover key moral insights and achieve this kind of moral consensus that we need, or can they last without this deeper anchoring in faith?
I do. I'm actually quite optimistic on this point, and I think there's both sort of a kind of rational, logical way of looking at it, and there's also just an empirical or historical way of looking at it. From the rational, logical perspective, I think it's important to say that the kinds of shared values that I think we need, the kinds that in a lot of cases religious traditions are putting forward, are ones that are equally sound from a very sort of rational utilitarian point of view. And by the way, that's not coincidence. Religions that put forward values that don't work well from a rational and utilitarian point of view don't tend to end up becoming dominant world religions, obviously, for various reasons. But the sorts of things that I think we see from whether it's from a religious tradition or a secular one, ideally being brought more into focus in terms of taking seriously duties and obligations, thinking about one's role not merely as a consumer and kind of autonomous free agent, but somebody actually embedded within institutions and who whose life and in terms of human flourishing and the good life needs to sort of have some sort of purpose. All of that you can justify on
religious
grounds, obviously. Those also happen to be just things that typically lead to better lives for people who have those things, end up healthier, wealthier, and wiser too. And so it's not like we're asking people to sort of make some fixed bayonet charge into machine guns here. We're for the most part actually asking them to to do things that they themselves say they want to do that are good for them, that people tend to know that are good for them. And what's missing is not the moral intuition, it's the sort of cultural confidence to actually assert that such moral judgments are actually legitimate against as we were talking about at the beginning, from both the center left and center right, this sort of classically liberal view that thou shalt not assert any such preferences, and people are merely sort of consumers who optimize their own behavior without the need for constraints. And so I think that's the battle that has to be fought. It's not a religious versus secular battle. It's a sort of nihilistic human as consumer versus grounded human as human fight.
Hmm.
And you don't have to be religious to have and win that fight. The one other thing I would just mention, and I am no scholar of moral traditions, but I have the good fortune to speak with such people who teach me these things. And as I was talking about some of this, someone said, like, go back and take a look at Cicero. I mean, Cicero's famous work On Duties is a sort of a foundational document of like Roman civilization. And it's not religious at all. It is a purely reasoned from secular grounds case for exactly the same thing. And so, very much in the spirit of like, there's nothing new under the sun here. It's not like somebody is trying, out of nowhere to like square this circle and solve this problem of a secular society by reverse engineering something. It's something that has a very long and storied tradition, and that we've only lost, I think, quite recently.
Yeah, fascinating. So, with respect to Cicero, I mean, was he not writing as a Roman who was not an atheist, but believed in theism? We can come back to that. So it's interesting you said
Hey,
you
look,
kind
I mean, this is interesting, right? Like, I don't know. I assume
of
he was
yeah,
a theist, but you can read
yeah,
On Duties as closely as you want, and you're not
right.
going to find him appealing to this or that Roman god or religious text for any of the things he's saying, both as a matter of kind of logical foundation, and I think very importantly, one thing that's so interesting about Cicero is that as a sort of, you know, user of rhetoric, he is trying to make a public argument, right? He's not off in a monastery somewhere. And so what you're seeing from all that long time ago is this is what then was seen as the right way to build this case. And that the way that he was trying to make the case, what he thought would be persuasive, and to the extent you think he was successful, what apparently was persuasive was not an argument for these things based on religion.
Okay, interesting. Well, I don't know enough about On Duties, and I'll have to read that to see what its
Check it
ultimate
out. Pick up a
logical coherence
copy.
is. I will, I will. But just on this point, because you kind of made synonymous there, rational and utilitarian, and I would say that many of the things that you're pointing to as a little thin and not quite the thick expression of human flourishing, like autonomy and the kind of calculating, being counting mindset. Preoccupied with only certain values. I mean, I would say that, yeah, that comes more out of a secular context. And there's something about, the full intelligibility or the full horizon of a worldview that kind of makes sense of it all, normatively, logically, and empirically, as you're saying, that you find in the theistic picture and you don't in the secular one. So if you look at any concept, it's embedded kind of in this chain of causal and even purposive dependence and orientation. All of your relationships, they imply continuation. They even derive their significance. All of them, working a job, having friends, knowing things, because of the bonds you form through them, and those endure through time. And I would say like the longer the horizon, the more fulsome the kind of conception you have is, less transactional, these richer. Um, and when they kind of lose their significance when they become associated with these, I would call them kind of imposter or partial concepts in this fully immanent or secular frame. Like love's simply a set of processes and feelings, knowledge is only practical, not revelatory of deeper truth, just kind of the pragmatic next step. All of these sorts of things. And I think we see this in this pervasively kind of self-oriented, technocratic, utilitarian moral framework, which is associated with, I think, a lot of the things that you take issue with. So, and I think like, yeah, look, ultimately, everyone can be rational, and you don't have to be religious to have, to like kind of act well and all of that. Like, I don't buy that at all. But in some sense, like in a deeper way, culturally, um, having some of these richer concepts that you've referred to, they come out of this fuller religious frame, and I think we're kind of like cut flowers that can last for a bit of time, but we ultimately wither without it. So I don't know. That was kind of a long-winded way, though, of getting at this question of, is it actually those things that you take issue with that are actually quite secular versus religious frame? Curious for your thoughts.
Good question. I guess maybe I'd say two things about it. One is, one of the reasons I like using the term about utilitarian, the term utilitarian, is that I think utilitarianism itself is such a sort of useless concept. I mean, I remember, I think in high school when I first was first introduced to the concept, and it was like, as you can see, like, the utilitarian doesn't worry about human rights. And it's like, well, okay, what if I just declare like violating a human right as like worth 10,000 utils? Like it's completely arbitrary. And I think in the context that we're talking about here, there's some sense that like the utilitarian thinks like, oh, well, if sitting here and playing this video game is like more fun and satisfying than like going out and getting a job and like making something of myself, then I guess I'll just sit here and play the video game. But obviously that's not, like, again, that's a useless analysis. If you want to know what would actually be of greater utility to the person, you need a much wider aperture. And so even what now, obviously there are very serious utilitarian thinkers who would give you deeper answers to this, but the way that utilitarianism is sort of casually thrown around in this idea of like people as, pleasure maximizing autonomous individuals, there's a real time horizon problem. And the question is like, are you just sort of in the, immediate gratification sense, just doing what feels good at every moment? Or are you actually making decisions that build toward a good life? And my argument would be that certainly religion provides a very useful foundation for orienting people toward building that good life. But you don't need to be religious to make this distinction. You can, from a purely common sense and what I would call ultimate, like even if you wanted to be just a sort of profit maximizing economic actor, you would still end up probably making a lot of really good decisions. The problem is that I think gets lost so much, and this is again where I say it's an absence of conservatism, not an absence of religion, is that the assumption our society has made is that people naturally make good choices. And that if you just sort of leave everything up to the individual, they are welfare maximizing. And that's simply not true. People shorn of institutional context and forming experiences and guidance and mentorship and cultural norms don't make good decisions. And so, again, religion can be one form of that forming and shaping, but it's certainly not the only one. The other thing I would say is that, something that frustrates me about arguments that kind of lean back on like, yeah, but religion's the best way to do this, is like, even stipulating that that's true, it's just not responsive to our modern context. I mean, there's a real sort of, assume a can opener kind of problem with saying like, yeah, but like if we had a religious revival and brought back, early mid 20th century religious morality, like that would solve a lot of problems. It's like, okay. I'm not sure where that gets me. And I think it's not just sort of a random fact that religion is coming and going, strengthening or fading. I think what we've seen much more is that in a modern society and in an advanced capitalist economy, the modes of thought and incentives and aptitudes and all sorts of things that build a cultural and economic and political elite are going to be things that cut against religiosity in almost every case. And so I think it's just not plausible to think that you're going to build a modern society on a set of religious norms. I think you want one that's compatible with and welcoming of those who want to begin from a religious point. But I think it's very counterproductive to sort of hold up religion as the sine qua non of making this work, because I think it leads most people to throw up their hands when I don't think we need to be throwing up our hands at all.
Yeah, interesting. No, I certainly agree that, just saying like it's the answer. It's certainly kind of like almost a utilitarian way of making the argument, but undoubtedly there's a lot of similarities between certainly Catholic social teaching, which I want to ask you about now, and the kind of communitarian set of values that you're prescribing in the American Compass philosophy, if I can call it that. Particularly Catholic social teaching's emphasis on the value of work and its connection to human dignity, and the way it thinks about the core institutions of society, namely, the family, church, communal civil society, and how their strength is the catalyst for greater, social wealth and harmony, that sort of thing. Obviously, there are a lot of influential Catholic figures in the administration, like Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, who I know you know well. So how do these principles kind of jive or contrast with the individualism of broad swaths of the left and right?
It's a great question, and I guess speaking of Catholic social teaching and family and civil society, I must run and pick up my daughter from art club in just a minute. So we'll
Very good.
have to wrap up after this one. But I think I find Catholic social teaching to be a perfect example of what we were just talking about in terms of the kind of religious insight and foundation that is so powerful and valuable, but that's also entirely compatible with a secular starting point. And so, work, I think, is the classic example of this, where, you can go back and read Rerum Novarum and see the extraordinary construction of this argument about work from a religious starting point. You can also go read, not to compare my book with a papal encyclical, but if you're looking for the same argument made from a completely different starting point, you can go read The Once and Future Worker and see what cashes out as the exact same arguments about the importance of work and its foundational value and the need for people to be productive contributors and not just consumers, built entirely on the basic of economic analysis and social science studies. And so, this is, I became familiar with Catholic social teaching mostly from people reading the manuscript of the book and saying, wow, this sounds really strongly in Catholic social teaching. I'm a Jewish kid from New England. I'm like running and Googling, like, what is Catholic social teaching? Which isn't to say that like I independently invented it. I highly recommend Rerum Novarum over my own modest efforts, but it is to say that an insight like work matters does not require a religious starting point. It just requires a willingness to move beyond the market fundamentalism of sort of a radical consumer mindset and actually observe your fellow humans and life and think about what matters to people and why. And so, I think that at the end of the day, conservatism will always have a strong religious strain, but a healthy conservatism at the end of the day should equally be about looking at the world and observing it as it is and recognizing the limitations of humans and institutions and also their power, and trying to think about how you can bring these things together in a way that is going to promote human flourishing.
Very good. Well, perfect note to end on. It's been a fascinating discussion, Oren. Insight for us, our Canadian listeners, on the future of conservatism, the dynamics within it. Thank you for lending your time, Oren, and thanks for being with us on Inside Policy Talks.
This was fantastic. Thank you.